Welcome to the Cloud Native Testing Podcast. I'm Ole Lansmar, your host, and I've spent years building testing tools like SoapUI and Swagger, and now I'm the CTO at TestCube, where we're redefining testing for the cloud native landscape. In this podcast, we invite people in this space to discuss with us the challenges, solutions, and best practices for testing in Kubernetes and beyond, covering automation, CI/CD, GitOps, and more. This podcast is proudly sponsored by TestCube. If you're interested about how to test cloud-native applications and infrastructure, subscribe and stay tuned. Now let's dive into the episode. Thank you for joining. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Cloud Native Testing Podcast. I'm super honored and thrilled and amazed and happy to be joined today by Ramiro Berrelleza, who is the CEO and co-founder of Octeto, one of the first players in the ephemeral environment provisioning space for Kubernetes and cloud native, which is obviously super interesting from a testing perspective. Ramiro, welcome. Tell us about yourself.
Hi, Ole. Thank you. Nice meeting you. Very happy to be here. Honored to be part of the Cloud Native Testing Podcast. It's very excited. As we've discussed in the past, ephemeral environments and cloud native testing are two super important elements that often go together. So very excited to talk more about that. Can I share what we're seeing on the space and learn from you as well?
Yeah, so that's great. So let me just, how did this idea with Octeto and ephemeral environments get started? Was it driven by testing or by other needs or problems?
Actually, now that you mention it, there is a testing component to this. So like all good dev tools, Octeto started out of a personal vendetta that I and my co-founders had against the way we're building software. I'm a software engineer by trade. I've been lucky enough to have been working on the cloud native space from a long time. When I date myself, but from way before it was called cloud native. I was part of the team that was working on the first version of Azure at Microsoft. Then I was in one of the early DevOps startups here in California, then Atlassian. And in all of these places, one of the common challenges that every team I was at is it was really hard to test our software. We were going through this transition where before cloud native, software was mainly a monolith that you would compile on your desktop, run some tests, throw in CI, and then go to production. But the difference between, local machine and production was not as big as today. There were, of course, dependency challenges, compilation, it's work on Windows, so DLLs and all those wonderful things. Then after microservices and containers, that was no longer a problem. But then this problem of, hey, my laptop looks nothing like production started to happen a lot more. And that's something that we suffer at Azure. As we were building Azure, we had to build a new class of DevTools. Back then, we built this thing called Azure on a Box, which was a VM that replicated all the Azure infrastructure for us to be able to test our services in a way that was more realistic than, hey, this one component works, but not everything. So the same situation we saw at Azure, 10 years later, I saw at Atlassian as we were adopting all these cloud native patterns, microservices, async communication, automatic scale. So in all of these places, testing was very hard. Just validating, hey, my code works. Will it work in production? And at some point I was working at teams where honestly, there was no other way than on production. So we're just kind of throw our code to production, use feature flags, cross your fingers that nobody gets affected, and, spend a lot of time looking at logs to make sure that nothing broke. And that was not great from a morale perspective, not great from a dev experience perspective. So at some point, when I was done with Atlassian, Pablo, my co-founder, Ramon, and I were kind of talking, hey, we should do something together. Well, three of us at some point complain about the same thing. And it was like, hey, that's something there. And something if everybody has this problem from large companies to small startups, maybe there's something there. And that's how we started with this idea of, back then, actually, we're calling it cloud native development, which is, if you pick in our GitHub repo, you'll see that it was called CND at the early days.
Oh, okay.
Which, engineers make great marketers. And this was the vision, was, hey, as we move to this world of cloud native, it is crucial for developers to have access to dev environments that look like production to minimize this huge gap. And our journey started by helping developers put their code as fast as possible on these ephemeral environments And over the year, it has evolved to also build hooks for things like testing, build, secret management, and all these other things that makes an ephemeral environment truly useful. And that's where we're seeing a lot of our customers going now, is what you said, is now that they have ephemeral environments, hey, testing in those environments becomes very important. And, they're replacing the traditional CI environments of like a single box. And it's fascinating to see the industry kind of move forward. And I'm very happy that we've been able to play a small part on that.
My understanding is that you're leveraging Kubernetes and namespaces specifically to provision ephemeral environments. How big does Kubernetes play into this? Like the capabilities that Kubernetes provides to dynamically provision namespaces, etc. It does seem to me like that's a huge opportunity for someone like you to utilize that possibility to create ephemeral environments.
No, like Kubernetes was crucial for us. Actually, Pablo, our CTO, and I have been pretty involved on the container ecosystem from pretty much day one. Okay. At some point, Pablo was at Docker. I was at Atlassian pushing for kind of early container experiments. And we were at DockerCon when Kubernetes was announced to the public. And I remember both were like, oh, right, that was the missing piece. Why? Because I think why we couldn't do ephemeral environments before is what you're describing. Kubernetes is really good at spinning up infrastructure fast. 10 years ago, if you wanted to do ephemeral environments, that meant spinning up a bunch of VMs, and that would take 5-10 minutes per VM. Kubernetes, if you're sharing the cluster, if you have namespaces for your different ephemeral environments, which is the core of how the Octeto commercial solution works, it's almost instant. We have customers who are deploying very complex dev environments, and I'm talking hundreds of microservices per ephemeral environment, and maybe it takes 5-10 minutes to deploy the whole thing, which 10 years ago was unthinkable. And a lot of this has to do with Kubernetes abilities to kind of spin up infra fast, of give you this, which I think is a wonderful abstraction, the namespace, which most people don't need hard multi-tenancy. The namespace boundary is good enough. And we see that with a lot of our customers and users of open source, how having this, hey, I can give every developer a namespace where they can deploy this full ephemeral environment. It's a huge accelerator. And it's something that, to your point, I don't think we could have done it before Kubernetes. You could do some things like Heroku, but Heroku was doing kind of like a proto-Kubernetes thing, managing processes and containers. So same principle. And that's, to me, at least personally, is why we did this company now and not like 10 years ago. And that's why I think this whole ecosystem has grown so much, is because that building block enables so much.
Okay, cool. And do you see, me looking at it from a testing perspective, it seems like, that's why we have ephemeral environments, to be able to test intermediate, like versions, releases, builds, whatever. But are there other use cases that you see for ephemeral environments versus just testing? I'm sure there are. I'm the guy with the hammer, so everything looks like a nail. But maybe there are other options there.
No, it's very interesting that you mention it this way, because I have my own hammer, which is ephemeral environments, and I'm trying to push them everywhere. And I never thought until recently, and I think you and I had a conversation at KubeCon that kind of opened my eyes to this, is that, it's for testing. Like for us, testing was an afterthought. We're thinking of ephemeral environments in our initial primitive thinking was for fast feedback loops. I want to write code, see the results. As my understanding of this grew, that is testing, because you are, hey, is my code working as I'm expecting it to do? So, I think testing is a core use case for ephemeral environments, whether it's manual testing, hey, I'm running my code, then I go to an endpoint and I check, hey, is this endpoint responding as expected? All the way to, right now we're helping a customer, sadly I can't name the name, but it's very well-known company in the hiring somebody to do a gig kind of thing. And they're now spinning up hundreds of dev environments in parallel to do all their end-to-end CI testing. They're looking at chaos engineering. It's one of my favorite scenarios, because I'm also very passionate chaos engineering practitioner. So it's a cool mix. So we're seeing a lot of that. Now we're seeing other things emerging, to your question, and to not make this all about testing. One of my favorite scenarios is customers using ephemeral environments for their own customer research. We have a bunch of customers who they will equip their product managers with the ability to hey, you can spin up an entire environment that has all the components for product X. But this could be out of a branch that hasn't been released to main. This could be out of a demo branch. And then they can take this, go to an interview, go to the customer's office, Zoom, whatever, and they can show them this product working end to end that they can click, that they can react to. So that's one that I think is not obvious at first, very interesting. The other is that just came out of one of our customers, support. You have a customer, they come to you with a problem, you can spin up an environment, feed it all the data and all the state that mimics the customer's setup, and you can use that to reproduce the customer problem. And then once you have that production, a reproducible state, you can take this environment, set as is to the dev team, say, hey, we have this problem, can you help me fix it? Can you, whether it's a product fix or a customer-facing fix. So we're seeing a lot of that coming up. And the way I think about this is once the ephemeral environment becomes a unit on its own, it's no longer the microservices that, hey, the environment as a whole gets deployed, gets destroyed, gets upgraded, all those things. I think all of the scenarios open up from very sophisticated testing scenarios to mobile teams using ephemeral environment to test their applications like on their demo devices, all the way to this customer facing. Once we had the CTO of one of our customers using the Octero environments to demo the next version of their product in a conference to their own kind of stakeholders, which was very cool because they didn't tell us, but then I was watching the conference and I was like, hey, that link in the URL looks like not the company name. What's going on there? And then I asked them and they told me, oh yeah, no, we have this branch kind of ready for the CEO and we just deployed the day before the conference. And the CEO was able to kind of show the full product running in front of 1,000 of their potential customers way before this was merged to production, way before this was ready for prime time. So those scenarios to me is fascinating because I think it's something that in the past was really hard to do. And at the end of the day, it is about faster feedback loops. It is about testing because all of this is about helping us ship value faster, helping us kind of bring down some of the traditional gates that we had in the past. You have to wait for CI to go before you merge it, and you have to wait for it to be production before you can show it to a user. And that's one of the things that I'm very excited to see as more and more people in our space adopt ephemeral environments as a core piece of their software development strategy. So it's very exciting.
So I have a bunch of questions in my own thoughts. So one is around that we're specifically in the context of testing, right? When you spin up an ephemeral environment, you usually want to prime that with some kind of data set, right? So like you said in the support case, but you might want to take a snapshot from a production environment, right? So you create the ephemeral environment maybe to reproduce an issue, right? Or a bug. And then to be able to do that, you need to prime, whatever persistent storage you have in that ephemeral environment, or that ephemeral environment is dependent on with that set of data. Is that, to me, seems like not always easy, but it's very important to be able to run reproducible tests on reproducible data sets. How is that something that is made easier with ephemeral environments, or is it maybe a product feature of Octero specifically, or what are your kind of thoughts and experiences around working with fixtures?
This is one of my other kind of personal vendettas. I don't like fixtures. I don't like this kind of having to run this seed script at the beginning of your setup, because in my personal experience, they tend to be very flaky. They are very quickly out of date and all those things. So in my view of ephemeral environments, especially in development use cases, actually for everything, data is fundamental. And I think that is the piece that most people forget when thinking about their ephemeral environment strategy. Because, level one, you want to have an environment on a single command that you can deploy, that takes very little time to run, and that looks like production, or as close as you want it to be. That is kind of stage one. But then you have to do things with it. And that's where data becomes a very fundamental part, because in modern applications, most of the issues that we have, most of the serious bugs come because of data. Transactions, that's what really matters. Now, there's this joke that all we do is move bits from one database to another. And to a point, it's true, because whatever we build, we're building solutions to enable customers to do something. And that something at the end tends to be state. If you're making a bank transaction, if you're buying something online, if you're calling a car, that's what really matters. No? How you get that is what we enable. So data is fundamental because that's where a lot of things break. They'll break because, data incompatibility, because you didn't assume that, hey, there's some parts of the world where there's only people have two last names, not one, or where names are not just, ASCII characters. Data is fundamental, and it is hard because it requires kind of a strategic approach. And at Octero, we ended up a couple of years ago building a feature to help kind of like developers bring data into their dev environments. And in our case, and going back to Kubernetes, we leverage a bunch of Kubernetes features like volume snapshots, PVCs, all those things. And through Octero, you can build this kind of like supply chain, so to speak, data supply chain, where you can have data in production in a source environment. You can automate getting the data out of that source environment, save it in Kubernetes on Octero on like volume snapshots. And then in our world, when a developer spins up an environment, all that data is automatically there. It's the same data because you're not seeding, you're actually cloning the data sources. It's more reliable. It's way, way faster. Like in our benchmarks, data cloning is 80% faster than data seeding for like large data sets.
Sure.
And what's really cool is that you can fully automate this. We have one of our customers is this big e-commerce store. And they have the whole thing fully automated that every weekend they take a dump from production. They would clean the data, remove all PII. Then they make that data available in Octero so that Monday morning, if you deploy an environment, you have fresh data from that looks like production, that it's for you to develop. And now they have this automated every week. Nobody has to think about it, which for me is the most important thing about these technologies is when you get to the point that nobody thinks about it. It's like, of course, I have an environment with data. What else would I have? That to me is kind of like when you achieve success in an organization, and we're seeing that across multiple places. I think not everybody is there yet. I think to me that is the next frontier of ephemeral environments is ephemeral data. And there's many ways to do this, but I like the get it from production, clean it, make it available for developers.
Well, I was going to ask, but for testing specifically, you probably want a recurring data set to be used, right? So you don't want a new data set from production. Well, it depends on either you build your tests to be not too dependent on data, which I guess can be hard in many cases, or do you said you don't like fixtures. I'm just kind of thinking of how does that play out in a testing environment where you need to make sure that, your application can handle, invalid data or certain data sets or blah, 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 all of those kind of things.
No, that's a great question. So a couple of things where I feel like ephemeral environments really help here is you can have multiple data sets. So in this example that I described, when they create these data sets, they also keep the older ones. So in the case of Octero, but this is like when you deploy an ephemeral environment, you can pick your data set. What I like about this approach and why I think is superior to fixtures is because you can have that, run your tests. When you're done, destroy, launch another ephemeral environment, load a different data set if needed, go at it again. I don't think it's an either or. I think fixtures have a place, and especially for invalid data. At some point, you do want to inject data in your system that isn't supposed to be there because that's real. Like in real world, not every data is clean. Yeah, it happens. That's another aspect where I like the fact that, you have an environment where you have a database, you have some data loaded, you can do those things. And because it's ephemeral, one, if anything goes wrong, you destroy it, launch another one. You're not blocking other people like what happens on traditional shared staging environments. The other is you can then start to introduce all these tools to your dev toolkit, right? You can have fixtures for this kind of class of testing. You can have real data maybe for end-to-end testing for smoke. You can have data sets from a few weeks ago because you want to test migrations. Like this opens all these doors to make it easier for developers to test, because I think one of the reasons that a lot of developers tend to be test averse, especially for the more complex testing, is because it's hard. Years ago, I gave a talk with Uma from Chaos Native on chaos engineering, and they did some research, and one of the reasons why people were not adopting chaos engineering is this perceived complexity of oh my God, I have set up all these 25 different things manually before running, which meant most people will not do it unless they were forced to. And I think a lot of the kind of complex testing that cloud native testing requires can be made more palatable by automating all these things and giving developers all these tools, because nobody likes to make production. Nobody likes to deploy to production and then have to sit there and look at tool and look at logs. It's annoying. It always makes you feel bad when you work something. So I think there's a space there for all of us to kind of give the same way that, like TestCube helps execute those tests in a way that before was very manual. So I think all of these tools together make this offering a lot more interesting, a lot more powerful. And I like that it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think that's a very cool thing about the whole Kubernetes space, is how easy it is plugging things together, because we have this common layer that is Kubernetes and very powerful. And like you can use TestCube and Octero and anything else together without like a lot of complexity.
And I think we're seeing, I mean, impressive with customers, I'm sure you see it on your end, how much effort they spend to build their own kind of platform engineering or pipelines, or kind of how they build their own kind of support infrastructure for their specific needs. And there's so many tools to choose from in the cloud native landscape, but they're all built on the same fundamentals. So it's reasonably easy to plug them. I mean, sure, there's obviously the challenges, but it's reasonably easy to kind of plug them together because they're grounded in the Kubernetes space that kind of sets certain predicaments for how things work and how things interact. So I think that's really gives a lot of flexibility to the ops and the platform engineering and developers to kind of really build a platform that works for them and maybe caters to how their business works. So I think that's super interesting, but it's also very complex to get to that level.
Yeah, it is a complex tool, but I think that we forget how much worse it was before. I always feel like, every generation of tools solves a problem and then creates new problems, but the new problems are not as complex as before. Integrating tools before Kubernetes was very complex. Like, unless you had something like Jenkins, it was just kind of like this open book of like run anything, but build everything, and nothing was compatible. Or you came from kind of like the Microsoft world where everything was highly integrated, but had to be everything inside the Microsoft world, which was also very pricey and had all these other challenges. I think we're in a good path there. And I think that a lot of things also seem more complex because our applications are way more complex than before. The expectation of the scope of an application, of the resiliency, of the quality, has grown immensely. Our users are way more sophisticated than, we all started, building software where, it was more of a, it kind of works, that's good enough. Now it's like, no, there's no space for crappy software anymore.
Okay. So one other thing I wanted to ask you about, we see with our customers, at least, the ephemeral environments often used kind of as a CD post CI thing, right? So you build your artifacts, your Docker images, you push them to registry, and then you spin up an ephemeral environment where you either with Argo or whatever mechanism you're using, and then you run your tests against that. But my understanding is that you can also use ephemeral environments much earlier in the development loop while you're actually coding. Let's say I'm building a microservice that interacts with other microservices. I could spin up an ephemeral environment that contains the dependencies, and then either use like teleport or telepresence or something else mechanism to help me while I'm actually coding locally before I even commit and build. Is that correctly understood? And or do you see that use case, or is it mostly more of a post CI?
No, that is actually in my vision, that to me is the biggest accelerator for ephemeral environments. Like the core of our product, Octero, is two pieces. One is the platform to manage these environments at scale. And the other is a set of tools, this very comprehensive set of tools that we built to make ephemeral environments super easy to use for development. Like the core mission of Octero is you run one command. That command, Octero up, is going to connect your local computer, your file system with your ephemeral environment, so that anytime you open a terminal, anytime you modify a file, all this will be immediately reflected on this ephemeral environment. And the idea for this is fast testing, fast feedback loop. I don't want developers to have to wait until CI to then run their code on a realistic environment with Octero. And Telepresence does something similar to a point, and there's a few others in the space. It's becoming which I love, it's becoming a very rich space with different opinions, but all of us agree on the importance of you need to get your code to these environments as fast as possible if you want it to be part of the core dev experience. You want to be able to make it that it feels like it's local and that you can use your common tools. So a lot of our customers do that now, where now they have Octero. Octero becomes the default dev, not only Ephemeral, but also the default environment for development. There's no local version anymore. Everything runs remote, and they use our tooling to give their developers this experience of like sync code, remote debugging, remote test execution, and all of these things. Even for dev, before CI, before merge, before any of those things.
I mean, we still see, I mean, I know it's not the preferred way to go, but we do still see a lot of organizations with QA teams, right? Who do like integration testing, security testing, compliance testing, etc. And for them, this must also be very helpful to be able to write tests against an ephemeral environment, right? So I need to spin up an ephemeral environment so I can create my integration tests or whatever kind of tests I need to do. So it's a dev loop for test development, because as much as we want to shift left and we talk about it, we still often see teams that are more dedicated to making sure that everything works as a whole as QA teams, which I think also there's value in that, definitely. So not disputing the value of having QA teams. Have you seen that at all, that QAs use specifically ephemeral environments to write tests and to validate that their tests are working in the sense that they seem to be testing the right thing?
I have. Yeah, that's another very interesting use case that I forgot to mention, which is traditionally a lot of testing only happens on CI because it's very hard to set up, because you didn't have this kind of like end-to-end environments. So typically, there's a stress, load, end-to-end testing, UI-based, like playwright kind of testing. We're seeing that a lot with our customers, where they're now using ephemeral environments for that reason as well. They will spin up the ephemeral environment on a branch, maybe on main, and then you have the QA teams iterate. And one of the really cool things that we are seeing is this is also helping kind of reduce the black boxiness of this class of testing. Part of the fast feedback loops that I see now with Octero is now you can run the same tests when you're developing than on CI, with the same command, with the same configuration. And the value of this is that you don't have to wait until the CI cycle. So QA teams can develop this test very fast, because when you're building something like on GitHub Actions, you have to like write the action, push it, wait for it to run, then something fail, then you add some logs, and it takes forever. If you could run everything locally, or everything like as you write code, you go like 10, 20 times faster. So you can do that with test execution, ephemeral environments, and your favorite, like test execution framework. Like you can use TestCube, you can run Playground, right, locally if you want. For me, the value is in these three pieces: is you have the code, you have the test executor, and the environment. And if you can use those things before you even commit code, before you push, that allows the QA developer to write these tests much faster. We're also seeing more sophisticated testing because they get to tinker more and kind of like understand better all the pieces. And also, as an added bonus for developers, a test fails, now they have a way to run the test from their workstation. They don't have to wait for another CI cycle, which also speeds up solving the issue that these tests uncovered. One of our large customers, the reduction of CI cycles was one of their main targets for their developer experience program, which was very interesting. And they were investing on ephemeral environments and this kind of testing, this class of testing, to reduce those cycles, because they know that each of the cycles adds hours to the day, makes every developer go slower, which means they're missing their targets and all of these things. And it was fascinating to see it. And it's really cool when you see it working in concert. The QA team building the tests, developers running them, not just as this annoying thing that breaks every now and then, but as a tool to verify. And, it doesn't work all the time, but when you see it working this way, it's very powerful. And it really shows why you have to invest in QA, why you need to write this kind of more comprehensive tests, why they're not just this gate, but are actually a tool to help you ensure that you're shipping high quality software as fast as you possibly can. So to me, that's a fascinating kind of combination, and it's really cool to see.
Amazing kind of to see that, like one of the many advantages of cloud native development and kind of building out Kubernetes, that it allows you to do these kind of shifts in your development lifecycle, find these gains with the right tools. Awesome. Ramiro, thank you so much. This has been great. Amazing to hear about so many facets of ephemeral environments that I didn't know about. So I learned a lot. And thank you so much for joining and sharing. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, Ale. Bye.
Bye.